1, 2, 3, 4. I got thoughts running through my head. I got thoughts, can't you see? I got thoughts, the books I read. I got thoughts, won't you listen to me?
One of the other inspirations for the book was the town of Quitman, Mississippi. Just to read from Wikipedia here, Quitman is a city in Clark County, Mississippi, United States, along the Chickasaw River. 2010, the population was 2,323. I actually think that's lower than it was when I lived there, but I could be wrong about that. It's a town that's about 30 miles south of Meridian, 30 miles north of Waynesboro, which, those two cities are important to me because when I was born in Meridian and lived outside of Meridian, and my grandparents on my mom's side were from Waynesboro, so I would spend a lot of time, Meridian, Quitman, and Waynesboro all along I-45, not I-45, Highway 45. That was kind of where I grew up. I lived outside of Meridian, about 12 miles outside of Meridian when I was born, when I was in elementary school. And, went to elementary school in Meridian, Mississippi. And at the age of 9, or right before my 9th birthday, we moved to Quitman because my mother had graduated and had gotten a job teaching at the Quitman School District. My dad had been working as a postal carrier in Quitman for as far as I can remember. I mean, he obviously didn't do it his entire life, but, my life, most of it, he was working there. And so he had been driving back and forth to Quitman, and so we moved there when I was 8, and we lived there until I was 12. Right before my 13th birthday, we moved to Madison, Mississippi, which is a suburb of Jackson. Quitman is a small town. It is a small rural Mississippi town. And I have not been back there in over a decade. Don't have a reason to. I don't really have any friends from there that I have kept in touch with. My family, most of my family that lived in Waynesboro and all that, they've moved either up here or somewhere else or have passed away. So I haven't really been there in a while. So to do research on this, I kind of use Google Maps and their Street View, where you can get in the Street View, and was surprised to see that some things had changed, but for the most part, the city's still the city that it was, or town, not really a city. When I say small town, rural Mississippi, you may have an image in your head of places like Philadelphia, Mississippi, where you might have seen from Mississippi Burning, Canton, Mississippi, which is larger, and it's about 10 miles north of me now, 10, 15 miles north. You'll have an idea of what it looks like, but if you've never lived in a place like that, it's different than a city or suburb. And in the 80s in Mississippi, it was very different than it is now. I always tell my wife, who's from the north, who's from Connecticut, I always tell her about some of the things I grew up with in Quitman. And one of the ones that always just throws her off is segregation. Now, I never went to school in segregated schools. I didn't even realize when I was in elementary school that, having African American children next to white children was odd, because I grew up always around, African American and white kids and all that. And so didn't think anything of it. But I mean, literally 5, 10 years before that, the schools have been segregated. Well, in Quitman, the schools were not segregated. They definitely were not segregated. But the legacy of segregation was still there. For instance, we would ride the school bus. Well, there were 2 buses for every route. There was and we would call it this, there's the black bus and the white bus. And it would go down the same route, the literal same route. If there was a black child that lived a mile down the street from me, he would ride a different bus. Now, we lived outside of town, so the population density wasn't very dense and all that. So I don't think there were a lot of African American people around me, at least not that I can remember. But there literally was a black bus and a white bus. And that's horrible. When you're 10, that's the way it is. That's the way things work. I remember specifically one time I missed the bus when I was in 5th grade. And the 5th grade school was right at the edge of north edge of town. And it was just 5th graders. My mom worked at the junior high, so I had to take a bus to the junior high to get her to pick me up, take me home. And the only bus I could get was a black bus. So I'm the only white kid on a bus full of black children. Now, that means nothing as far as me breaking through white privilege and understanding being different. But it does give me a little slice of just feeling like you stick out, like you don't belong here, which sadly enough, that should have never happened for me or for those kids. There should never have been this situation where those kids felt weird on my bus. It should be our bus, that was just so. I'm kind of going all over the place, but that's kind of a give you an idea of what Quitman was then, and what the impressions I have of Quitman. In Quitman, there's a Highway 45, I believe, or 145, that runs through the middle of town. And it's, the main street goes by the courthouse and all that, and I describe it as Jack comes into town. And there was a train track through the middle of town that ran into, I think it's a paper mill. And you can always tell it's there because you drive by and it stinks horribly. If you've never been around a paper mill, wow, it's terrible. It smells like, the devil has farted and just keeps farting. And it's just there. It just hangs around. It just follows you. Well, that train track going right through town, that was a literal divider between where the African American, the black families lived, and the white families lived. I'm not saying that there weren't people who lived on both sides of it, but when I lived there, it was a clear divider. It wasn't just an economic divider, because you could tell that the part of town, the black part of town, was poor, did not have the same resources. But it was a racial divider. It was bam, right there. And I can only imagine what it must have felt like to be an African American child there and feeling that wall, feeling that barrier, because that barrier was as sacrosanct as you could get. It was palpable. And that's not to say that the kids, my age and the kids I was around, that's not to say that we didn't hang around with each other, we didn't play with each other, because we did. But that was at school. And you go home, chances are you didn't see them when you weren't at school. Not just because they're on the other side of town, but you didn't go to the other side of town. So, I want to say like I'm shrugging it off, but that's kind of Quitman in the 80s. And like I said, I haven't been there, and I don't know if it's still like that now. I hope not. But just looking at some of the pictures of Street View, it's very similar. It doesn't change much. I've always said that in Mississippi, if you go 10, 15, 20 minutes outside of a city, 20 miles outside of a city, you go back 10, 20 years. Because you literally do. It isn't just the fact that people in rural Mississippi don't have internet access, or don't have broadband internet access. They've got dial-up. It's frozen in amber. And I think it's a bit of a shame, because, and I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but I think, it's part of what's holding Mississippi back. Not just that we have so much rural area, but rural areas tend to want to stay in the past. Looking at the Wikipedia page for Quitman, it appears that the population now, as of 2010, is actually more African American than white, which I don't think that was the case when I was there, but not like I would know. Quitman, seat of Clark County. I grew up there, spent four school years there, so about 4 years, but it was pretty formative years. Quitman, Mississippi.